Today we're taking a look at a wrestling book that was published in 1925. Hi guys, my name is Joe and welcome to Fighting Words, the martial arts library. On this channel I review martial arts books and talk about other martial arts related subjects. Today I'm going to be reviewing the book Scientific Methods of Wrestling, published in 1925 and written by Paul Prehn. Mr. Prehn had been a very competitive wrestler throughout his youth. He had competed in amateur wrestling before he joined the United States Armed Forces, and then competed in the armed forces before turning his eye toward making a run at what at the time was the world middleweight title in wrestling. Then he became a coach, and that's sort of where this book grew out of. This book is largely taken from the perspective of a college wrestling coach on how to train wrestlers for collegiate wrestling and how to grow the sport. Of course, there's a great deal of techniques throughout the book, and we're going to get to those. In the early introductory section, Mr. Prehn talks about the importance of play and how wrestling is very good for coordinating the mind with the body. And there's sort of that emphasis on how participating in a form of play, things like football are also brought up, will lead to good habits and good physical and mental health. He also will quote in this section from a book called Psychology and Athletics by author Coleman R. Griffin. And Mr. Griffin will expound upon the benefits of sport and play and how it builds respect between individuals, and also how this sort of thing encourages clean living and once again is good for both the body and the mind. Following that, the author gets into equipment for wrestling. He begins by talking about a mat, which for them is 3 inches of sawdust with a mat spread over the top of that. They also discuss the use of a ring between 16 square feet and 24 square feet. So apparently even in collegiate competition, an actual ring, like a boxing ring, was used. He then goes over the costume, in other words, your uniform, and notes that there are some variations. He makes a big point about having things like the knees and elbows covered so that you won't get mat burn, for instance. There's also a brief section on cauliflower ears and how one can wear specially designed headgear to prevent that. He's got a section on coaching which covers a lot of ground. This includes things like, how to select a wrestling team and how to conduct tryouts. It includes things like nutrition and cutting weight. It also includes fundamental calisthenics. One thing that was noticeable to me is that they don't use the term push-up, they say a forward lean, but it's clearly a push-up. They also include some partner drills for developing balance and the ability to off-balance one's partner. In this section, he will also give a recommended weekly workout for the wrestling team, a Monday through Friday program. And in some instances, these focus on things like building specific skills. In others, he says, this is the time, if you know you got a meet coming up, to take a look at your opponent if you know what probable skills and techniques that they will use, so that you can drill some of your wrestlers specifically to counter their opponent. Now bear in mind that this is years before readily available film study was out there. An odd addition in this section is a brief discussion of mixed bouts. So that would be wrestlers versus boxers. He's of the opinion that wrestlers, as long as they keep their chin down, win this almost all the time. I think that's been borne out by the early no-holds-barred matches. But it was sort of weird to include it here, so I guess in 1925 they were still having those types of matches. And finally, the chapter as a whole ends with a section on sportsmanship, and he's really encouraging that part of it. And this sort of echoes a tone that he's had throughout the book, which is, this is good for building character, this is good for building communities. When guys beat one another in tryouts, they tend to become the best of friends because they've had that communal experience. Finally, we get into the instructive section of the book. Unfortunately, this side is very light on photographs. Again, it was published in 1925. I would expect getting a photograph for each technique and sending that out to the printer was probably cost prohibitive at that point. When we get into the actual techniques, the author begins with probably the most logical part, which is going to be things like stance and how to tie up with your opponent. In this section, he will also include something that he refers to as the wrestler's grip. He describes this as right hand palm up, left hand palm down. Place the thumb of the right hand between the last two fingers of the left hand, and then conceal the left thumb in the palm of the hand, which I'm having trouble doing in a way that isn't uncomfortable. This is the grip that he uses throughout. Honestly, I have questions about it. It doesn't appear to have survived into the modern day. After that, the author begins to go into ways of getting behind one's opponent, and just about all of these are also followed immediately with how to counter what your opponent just did. That's going to be a theme throughout the technique section. We're going to get a technique illustrated or discussed, and then the author will immediately afterwards show how to counter that, or discuss how to counter that. This section we will see things that are familiar to modern audiences. There's one that he refers to as a forward switch. We would recognize it as an arm drag. He also has a go behind, although again I think he uses different terminology for that, but most of this is going to be familiar to modern audiences. Oddly, in this section he also chooses to include the tackle, and he shows a few variations of that. One is dropping down and cupping the heels of both of your opponent's legs and driving him backwards. Another is getting a clasp around the lower part of the hips of one's opponent. In this section, we're also going to get some trips, including a number of trips from the rear. And again, counters are presented immediately after. After that, we get to a section on moves that are down on the mat. He covers a few different positions here. One is on the hands and knees. Another is actually seated with sort of the legs splayed in front, and another is sort of a half-seated, half-kneeling position. From here, he will give ideas on how to execute what we would call breakdowns, in other words, how to flatten the opponent out. He will also discuss multiple ideas for how to escape these various positions. This section leads into a section on the variations of the Nelson. So, for instance, the half Nelson, the further Nelson. He does briefly discuss the full Nelson. He notes that it is illegal in most amateur settings. His take on it is that it's actually dangerous for the person applying the hold, because from the sound of it, he's afraid that you might be turned onto your back as you're trying to apply the full Nelson onto your opponent. After that, we get parts on the body scissors, both from the front and rear. These include sort of the straight body scissors or straddle position, as well as a figure four position. These days, in grappling circles, it's known as the body triangle. We also get some work when it comes to front and side headlocks as a means to take an opponent over, and he also mentions holds being used for punishment here. Following that is a section on the double wrist lock, which some may recognize as a kimura. He also covers a reverse wrist lock, which again some may recognize as a key lock or an Americana. He discusses the double wrist lock as a way to get a reversal primarily from the bottom. He also will show accompanying techniques with this. So in arm scissors, where you're scissoring your legs around the opponent's arm, this is basically a crucifix style position considered in modern grappling. We'll also get some head scissors positions from here. Unfortunately, this is also where we begin to see the book get a little disorganized. For instance, the following techniques include something he refers to as a jackknife, which is, from the sound and look of it, a cradle, so a pinning position. He also discusses a body lock from standing as a way to get the opponent to the ground, then also a reverse arm scissors, which we would recognize as a Jujigatame style armbar. It's a lock against the elbow. He explicitly says that it's used for punishment. Following that, we get more escapes from the bottom. He goes over things like the side roll, the switch, and again, the double wrist lock used as a way to get a reversal. Following onto that, again, we get sort of a grab bag of techniques. One of them is the short arm scissors. Some may recognize it these days as a bicep slicer. He considers this a good way to pick up a pin. In this section, we also get the flying mare, which is recognizable as an arm throw or shoulder throw. He also covers various pinning techniques, including some Nelson variations and some work from what he refers to as the inside crotch position. So if you are pinning an opponent on their back, you have one arm going between their legs and grabbing their hip and using that as leverage to pin them. After that, we actually get into leg locks, of all things. He covers a number of toe hold variations. Now, when this book was written, the toe hold was used to refer to anything where you grabbed the toe portion of the shoe or foot as you were applying your lock. So in this, we get what he refers to as the double toe lock, which today would be considered a standard toe hold that applies pressure primarily to the ankle. He also has a crossover toe hold, which looks like the professional wrestling maneuver, a step over toe hold. So you are folding the opponent's leg over your own thigh. Shortly following this, he will show basically splits. In other words, how to stretch out the opponent's legs. He will show this from both the front and the rear. These days, some of these moves are still used as ways to pin someone in amateur wrestling. There's a move called a banana split, for instance, that could be considered a variation of one of these holds. And the end of the book will cover the variety of rules between a lot of the different amateur organizations. These include the AAU, or Amateur Athletic Union, the NCAA, or the National Collegiate Athletic Association, and also Western Intercollegiate rules. One thing to note in this section, considering everything that he's been telling us this whole time, there are several instances of holds that he presented in the instruction section that are banned under some of these rules. As far as the pros go, I think that this is an excellent look at what early wrestling looked like. I think there are some of these ideas that still hold up. There's a leg scissors variation that he has in here that I played around with when I'm caught in my opponent's half guard. If I'm the guy on top, I found that using an idea from here, I can sort of tuck my leg away and make it more difficult for the bottom guy to work any of his sweeps or escapes. And I'm sure that there are other ideas in here that we can take and work into modern grappling as well. As far as the cons go, there's a lot of little complaints I have. I guess the biggest one is that not everything that's described is accompanied by a photograph. Again, I'm sure that this was just part of the resources that they had available at the time, or the lack of resources that they had available. Some of the organization is pretty spotty. You know, they'll have an entire section on Nelson's, and then it's like, here's the short arm scissors and a body lock and something else. You know, there could be better organization in the book. Some of the stuff appears to be sort of thrown in there without any rhyme or reason. There are some minor errors, some differences between what the text is telling you that you're looking at and what you're actually seeing in the pictures. This only happens once or twice. And another minor little thing is that the author treats wrestling matches that we in modern times are pretty sure were fixed matches. He treats them as authentic contests. For example, Wayne Munn beating Ed the Strangler Lewis. Like, these days we are pretty sure that that was entirely a work. He treats it like a shoot. In other words, an authentic contest. And I think part of that is because the author is really trying to promote the art of wrestling. He doesn't want the audience that he's presenting this to think that there's anything weird going on. As far as recommendations go, I would say that if you are interested in catch wrestling as it was presented early, This has a lot of good stuff for that. I'd say if you are a grappler just looking for some new ideas, again, I think that there are some things that can be gleaned from this, things that are maybe unconventional today, but that existed back then. I also like it just sort of as an historical snapshot of how wrestling was done in the United States 100 years ago. That's all I have for this week. Thank you guys for following along with me. If you'd like to help support the channel, or if you have a request for a book review, please consider donating to my Ko-fi account. I'm going to put a link in the description. And that's all I got. Talk to you later.